Yes, it's true. I wasted £126,000 on a branding agency when we were developing the pushchair that you see behind me, which eventually launched with John Lewis. It was probably the third or fourth biggest mistake that I made with the product launch of the pushchair. If you want to hear a complete rundown of everything that I got wrong on that project, then do check out this other video. I will also link it in the description. But in this video, what we're going to focus on is that huge amount of money wasted with a branding agency and what you can take from that to ensure that you don't make the same mistake. But first, let me tell you the story. So I was working on this pushchair. I had a business partner who had a background in brand and marketing, and we were talking about the branding for the product. Now that basically means the tone of voice that the brand talks with. It means the fonts, the color palette, the logo, all those kind of things that together make up a brand. And I think if you think about, say, Pepsi and Coca-Cola, or you think about Nike and Adidas and Reebok, fundamentally those companies do the same thing, but they have a slightly different kind of brand image. And we were very aware we were launching a premium product. It was £900 up against some big established brands, and we wanted to create our own brand, and we wanted to ensure that was memorable to the customer, and that also was a premium brand that customers would then be prepared to part with that kind of money for one of our products. Now we were looking at different branding agencies, and we had quotes anything from like 15 to 30,000. I was dubious about the £30,000 quote, but my business partner was convinced that we needed to go with the best agency, and for him, I think at that time, the most expensive indicated the best. Now it's very true that agency was hugely convincing. They'd won a lot of awards, they had a beautiful studio, and they talked a lot about everything they'd done previously and how great their creative team was. And we went with the £30,000 option. Now, about 4 or 5 weeks later, they presented their work, and in it was nothing that was directly usable. I was really shocked. I was expecting for £30,000 to get a logo and some product descriptions and the kind of brand assets and brand guidelines document with all the fonts and the colors and how the logo is going to be applied to the product and everything else as well. But we didn't. What we got was this, as you can see on the screen, fairly extensive concept document, if you like, that starts to communicate basically what their ideas were and where they thought we should go with this. Now I was a bit shocked, and then they presented us with a proposal to do what I thought we were getting, which was to get all the brand assets sorted out, ready to go. And this was another nearly £100,000, and I genuinely couldn't really believe it. And I hold my hands up. I should have pulled the plug at that point. I'm not trying to blame my business partner in this. He was an advocate for using that company, but nevertheless, the final decision did rest with me. Now, we had this money in our bank. We'd raised a huge amount of investment, and we could therefore afford to go with this. But it was a huge mistake, as you will soon see why. Anyway, we had a massive international trade show coming up. This was the big launch. We needed all the assets this company was creating for that. So we needed banners that were going to be in this big hall where we were presenting. We needed the presentation template. We needed some of the photography in terms of how the brand did photography and how that was different from the other brands. And we needed these kind of various different icons and descriptions of the different features and everything else. And one of the big things that I guess meant that I didn't just call it quits and say, no way, you're not spending any more money with you guys at this point, was that they talked about brand strategy. And this was something I felt we needed. We had a lot of features in the product, things like the wheels that we wanted to call shock stoppers. And we had the brand name, we wanted to call it ARC, but I didn't really understand how we were going to put things like the name of the different features together with the big brand. We had good ideas at that point about licensing shock stopper wheels to other pushchair brands, and we wanted to ensure that actually that Shockstopper brand was protected in its own right and had its own brand style and everything else. So I guess we made it more complicated, but what I really wanted was a strategy for how we were going to do that and make that clear for the customer. Anyway, we went ahead with it. We spent the rest of the money, as I say, total of 126,000, and they produced a vast array of assets ready for our big reveal and our big launch. And then it absolutely bombed. So all these international distributors, these UK retailers and everyone else, they basically said, look, we like the product, we see what you've done with that, we like the functionality, we don't get the brand. We can't communicate this brand to your customers because we don't even understand it ourselves. And basically it got out of hand and it got overly complicated. And their photography style and the way they were going to do that was interesting and different, but it wasn't anything we ever used because it was so far away from what all the other brands were doing that it just looked odd and out of place in a store. And so we had a massive decision at that point as to what we would do. But before I tell you what we then did and how we solved this problem, let me just talk a little bit about how you can learn from this and what you might do differently if you're choosing a branding agency. So for me, the big problem was that the creatives developing this brand didn't ever test anything they'd come up with our target customer. So there was never any feedback. It wasn't as though they did the £30,000 worth of concept work and then they did a big focus group, went through with them the brand and got their feedback. I think if they had, they would have realised much earlier on this was way too complex and confusing and no one was ever going to understand it. And I think what the problem was is that actually what they were doing is designing a brand that would win them awards as a business rather than designing a brand that would help us sell more product. And I think whenever you're choosing an agency, whether it's brand, packaging, product design or anything else, you need to make sure that actually they are hugely targeted and focused on helping you achieve your commercial objectives. It's very easy for creative people to get carried away and think that actually what they're doing is designing something that they really like that's going to win peer-reviewed awards rather than focusing actually on what you need it to do. And whenever you commission an agency and whenever you're going through a project, I would make sure repeatedly that you are checking that with your target market and that it is resonating with your target market and it's something that actually is appealing to them. Ideally, we would have had a creative branding agency who actually were predominantly parents to be or recent parents or whatever who completely understood that target market because they were in it. You can't always achieve that, but I think that that is a goal to aim for if at all possible. And the other thing I would say, don't get taken in by all the glitzy awards, don't get taken in by the gloss, don't get taken in by the BS. Really focus on what you need as an objective. Try and see their process and how that is or isn't going to work for you and your objectives and whether that agency is going to deliver that for you. The other thing I would say is, upon reflection, that a lot of brands change. So the brand you start out with and the focus you start out with in terms of your messaging and everything else will evolve as you start selling products and as you get more feedback and as you talk to your customers and everything else. So I would always in future start with what I call a minimum viable brand. It's something that looks credible. If you're selling a premium product, then it needs to look premium in terms of your brand. Otherwise people aren't going to pay that kind of money for it. But I wouldn't go over the top with it. And I would save some of your funds for later on as you evolve the brand, as opposed to thinking about it as a big one-time exercise that will then stick for the next 10 years. So they don't really think that it's going to do that. So what's the end of the story? Just before that, please do subscribe the video. It helps me justify creating more content like this to help more people. So we came back from this massive unveiling and the big launch, and we basically had a decision. We could either rebrand and keep going, or we could give up. And at that point we decided we would rebrand. It cost us about another £20,000 to redo everything basically. And we did take a couple of elements from what the first company did. As I say, the logo we still kept, but a lot of the rest of it then we had to change, dramatically simplify and come up with something that actually was appealing and understandable by our target market. We relaunched then about 3 or 4 months later and it was effective. We landed John Lewis and we got in there. We wouldn't have done if the brand wasn't right and didn't fit the product. There's lots of other things that didn't work out, particularly COVID. The timing was terrible for our launch for all sorts of different reasons, but the rebrand was certainly a success. And I think there's a huge lesson in that. Just because it's expensive doesn't mean it's good. And whatever you do, make sure it is focused on achieving your commercial objectives. That's the critical part there. Hope you found the video useful. You might now want to check out this video that talks more about the other mistakes I made in the launch of that product, so you can learn from those as well. You can save your hard-earned cash and you can increase your chances of success.